The hotel ballroom had been dressed up to look like something from a different decade, though I couldn't decide if that made it charming or tragic. Balloon arches in our old-school colors framed the entrance, and strings of warm lights draped across the ceiling like someone had tried to recreate a high school gymnasium with a budget 3 times larger and taste twice as questionable. The DJ, a man who looked like he'd been spinning the same playlist since our actual graduation, was working his way through songs that once felt urgent and now sounded like echoes from a life I wasn't sure I'd ever really lived. I stood near the bar, nursing a drink that tasted like it had been mixed by someone who'd learned bartending from a manual, watching my former classmates move through the space with the kind of forced enthusiasm that comes with paying $60 to relive your adolescence. Everyone looked both exactly the same and completely different, as if someone had taken our 17-year-old selves and run them through a filter labeled mortgage payments and middle management. That's when I saw him. Victor Hale stood across the room, leaning against a pillar with his hands in his pockets, and for a moment I felt 30 years collapse into 17. He'd been Coach Hale back then, the man who'd pushed our basketball team harder than anyone thought reasonable, who'd made us run suicides until our legs shook and then demanded we run them again. But time had softened him somehow. The sharp edges of his face had mellowed, and there were threads of silver in his dark hair that caught the light when he turned his head. He wore a navy suit instead of the track pants and polo shirts I remembered, and without a whistle around his neck, he looked like someone I might pass on the street without recognizing. Except I would have recognized him anywhere. Our eyes met across the room, and I felt that old familiar tightening in my chest. The same sensation I'd felt at 17 whenever he'd called my name during practice, whenever his attention had focused on me like a spotlight I both craved and feared. He straightened when he saw me looking, and I watched him make his way through the crowd, moving with that same purposeful stride that had once commanded respect from a gymnasium full of teenagers. I expected him to offer some generic pleasantry about how long it had been, how different everything looked. Instead, when he reached me, he glanced around the decorated ballroom with something that might have been amusement playing at the corners of his mouth. He told me he didn't see me with anyone, nodding toward the dance floor where couples swayed beneath the colored lights. Then he said something that stopped my breath in my throat. He suggested he could take me to prom. Properly this time. The words should have been a joke. They should have dissolved into the kind of awkward laughter that fills the space between people who once knew each other but have become strangers. Instead, they hung in the air like a question that had been waiting 10 years to be asked. There was something in his voice, a weight, a possibility, that made me understand this wasn't casual conversation. This was something else entirely. I felt my pulse quicken the way it used to during those long-ago practices when he'd watch me shoot free throws, his attention like pressure against my skin. But now there was no coach and student, no hierarchy or expectation. There were just 2 men in their 30s, standing in a room full of artificial nostalgia, and the sudden, terrifying realization that some conversations can rewrite everything you thought you understood about your own history. I had built what most people would call a successful life. My apartment in the city was filled with furniture chosen more for its practicality than its warmth. A gray sectional sofa, a glass coffee table that never accumulated clutter, bookshelves lined with financial journals and novels I told myself I'd read someday. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. My routines were precise. Morning runs along the same route, coffee from the same shop, evenings spent reviewing market reports until my eyes burned, and sleep felt like surrender rather than rest. From the outside, it looked like I'd figured something out that had eluded my high school classmates. I had a corner office with windows that overlooked the financial district, a salary that afforded me vacations I rarely took, and a LinkedIn profile that suggested steady, upward trajectory. But standing in that decorated ballroom, surrounded by the ghosts of who we'd all been, I felt the weight of what was missing from that carefully constructed life. The loneliness had become so familiar I'd stopped noticing it, the way you stop hearing the hum of an air conditioner until someone turns it off. There had been relationships, of course, dinners that stretched into uncomfortable silences, weekend trips that felt like obligations, conversations that never quite reached the depth I craved. They all ended the same way, with polite explanations about timing and compatibility, with me standing in my pristine apartment wondering what essential piece of myself I kept failing to offer. Coming back to this place unsettled me in ways I hadn't anticipated. The reunion committee had transformed the high school gym into something that looked like a prom from a movie. The kind of prom I'd never attended, the kind of night I'd spent hiding in my bedroom, claiming I had the flu while my classmates danced to songs that would later become the soundtrack to their nostalgia. The decorations were too bright, too eager, as if someone had decided that enough time and money could resurrect something that had never really existed, at least not for me. I told my parents I was too sick to go. I told my friends I couldn't find the right date. I told myself it didn't matter. That one night couldn't possibly hold the significance everyone else seemed to attach to it. But the truth was simpler and more complicated. I'd been terrified of being seen. Terrified of standing in a room full of people and having them glimpse whatever it was I'd spent 4 years trying to hide. The fear had felt rational at 17. At 30, it seemed like a choice that had shaped everything that followed. Victor looked different without the whistle and the clipboard, without the weight of authority that had once made him seem larger than life. When he'd been Coach Hale, he'd commanded our respect through discipline and an unwavering belief that we could be better than we thought we were. He'd pushed us past our limits, had made us run drills until our legs wobbled and our lungs burned, had seen potential in gangly teenagers who couldn't see it in themselves. But he'd also been untouchable, existing in that space that teachers and coaches occupy, present but separate, influential but ultimately unknowable. Now he was just a man in a Navy suit, and I could see the ways that time had marked him. There were lines around his eyes that suggested sleepless nights, a softness in his posture that spoke of burdens carried. I'd heard fragments of his story through the gossip network that connects everyone who grew up in the same small place. The divorce that had surprised everyone, the decision to leave coaching, the quiet retreat into a profession that helped people heal their bodies instead of pushing them to their breaking points. He'd arrived alone, just as I had. And I wondered if his solitude felt as deliberate as mine, or if it was something that had happened to him gradually. The way erosion changes a landscape, so slowly you don't notice until the shape of everything has shifted. Looking at him across that room full of artificial nostalgia, I realized we were both products of the same process. The slow accumulation of choices and circumstances that had brought us to this moment, standing in a decorated gymnasium, carrying the weight of lives that looked successful but felt somehow unfinished. The setting felt like a mirror, reflecting back not who we'd become, but who we'd been afraid to be. The balloon arches and string lights couldn't disguise the fact that this was still the same space where we'd learned to perform versions of ourselves that felt safe, acceptable, survivable. But 30 years had passed, and the performance had become exhausting. Maybe that's why Victor's words had landed with such impact. Maybe that's why the possibility he'd offered felt both terrifying and necessary. Standing there, watching him navigate conversations with former colleagues and old friends, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The sharp, uncomfortable awareness that my carefully ordered life might not be the achievement I'd convinced myself it was. It might just be another kind of hiding. The evening settled into the familiar rhythm of forced reunion conversations. I moved through the room like a ghost, nursing drinks that grew warm in my hands while former classmates shared updates about marriages and mortgages, children and career changes. Everyone seemed to be performing a version of contentment, reciting the same script about how quickly time had passed and how good everyone looked. I found myself nodding at appropriate intervals, offering the expected responses while feeling increasingly transparent, as if the years between 17 and 30 had somehow made me less substantial rather than more. But Victor didn't let me drift. Each time I thought I'd found a comfortable corner to observe from, he appeared beside me with a fresh drink or a gentle comment that drew me back into the present moment. It wasn't pushy or obvious, just a steady presence that refused to let me disappear entirely. When Mrs. Patterson from our English class cornered a group of us with photos of her grandchildren, Victor caught my eye and nodded toward the bar. When the DJ announced a particularly aggressive throwback song, Victor leaned close enough that I could smell his cologne and made a comment about how some things were better left in the past that made me laugh despite myself. Gradually, our conversations began to change. What started as polite catching up evolved into something more substantial, more honest. We found ourselves talking not about the safe topics that filled reunion small talk, but about the weight of the years that had passed. I told him about the job that paid well, but felt like wearing a suit that didn't quite fit, about the apartment that looked like a magazine spread, but never felt like home. He listened with the same focused attention I remembered from those long-ago practices, as if my words mattered in a way that most people's listening suggested they didn't. Victor's stories surprised me with their vulnerability. He talked about the divorce that had blindsided him 3 years earlier, how his ex-wife had finally admitted she'd never felt like she really knew him, never felt like he'd let her see beneath the surface. He described the burnout that had driven him away from coaching, the way he'd started to feel like he was pushing kids toward a version of success that he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. His voice carried a weariness that I recognized, the exhaustion that comes from maintaining a performance for so long that you forget what exists underneath it. The conversation took an unexpected turn when someone mentioned prom photos being displayed near the entrance. I made some throwaway comment about having missed the whole spectacle, expecting the usual sympathy about being sick that night. Instead, Victor grew quiet for a moment, staring into his drink with an expression I couldn't quite read. He told me he'd never gone to his own prom either. The admission hung between us like a confession. As a coach, he'd chaperoned dozens of them over the years, had watched generations of teenagers navigate that particular ritual of growing up, but he'd never experienced it himself. Coaching had consumed his 20s, he said, and even if it hadn't, even if he'd had the time and opportunity, he wasn't sure he could have shown up honestly. He wasn't sure he'd known how to be honest about anything back then. I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition that went deeper than shared experience. There was something in the way he said it, something in the careful neutrality of his tone that suggested layers beneath the surface. I found myself studying his profile as he spoke, seeing not the authority figure from my adolescence, but someone who might have been carrying his own careful performance all these years. The noise of the reunion seemed to fade around us. Other conversations became background hum, and I became aware of the strange intimacy of standing close enough to someone that their voice felt like it was meant only for you. When Victor turned back toward me, his expression had shifted into something more serious, more deliberate. He said maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe tonight, he could be my date to prom. The words carried less jest this time, less of the casual suggestion from earlier in the evening. There was something almost formal about the way he said it, as if he were extending an actual invitation rather than making conversation. I laughed, but it came out nervous and uncertain. The idea was absurd on its surface. Two men in their 30s, pretending that a decorated hotel ballroom could somehow become the prom we'd never attended. But there was something else beneath the absurdity, something that made my pulse quicken in a way I hadn't experienced in years. What if we could rewrite those nights we'd spent alone in our respective bedrooms, afraid to be seen? What if we could finally show up as ourselves, whatever that meant? The possibility felt both terrifying and intoxicating. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I wanted to say yes to something that made no practical sense, something that offered no guarantee except the chance to step outside the careful boundaries I'd spent decades constructing. Standing there beside Victor, surrounded by the artifacts of our shared past, I felt something awakening that I'd thought I'd successfully buried years ago. What followed was the strangest courtship I'd ever experienced, though I'm not sure either of us would have called it that at the time. We began to orbit each other through the evening like binary stars, drawn by some gravitational force neither of us quite acknowledged. Victor would drift away to fulfill the social obligations that reunion attendance demanded, conversations with former colleagues, polite inquiries about mutual acquaintances, the ritualistic exchange of business cards that would never be referenced again. But he always returned, appearing at my elbow with a fresh drink or a wry observation about the earnestness with which our former classmates were trying to recreate their youth. I found myself watching for him across the room, tracking his movement through conversations the way I might have watched him pace the sidelines during a particularly tense game. There was something magnetic about his presence that I'd forgotten, or perhaps had never allowed myself to fully acknowledge. The way he listened to people with complete attention, the way his rare smiles seemed to transform his entire face, the quiet authority he carried even in civilian clothes. It all felt familiar and foreign at once, like returning to a childhood home that had been redecorated in your absence. The dancing started almost by accident. The DJ had worked his way through the predictable roster of reunion favorites and settled into something slower, more intimate. Couples began to sway beneath the string lights, and I watched them with the detached curiosity of someone observing a ritual they'd never participated in. That's when Victor appeared beside me again, this time with something different in his expression, a kind of gentle determination that reminded me of the way he used to approach particularly difficult conversations with his players. He extended his hand with a slight smile and asked if I remembered how to dance. I told him I'd never learned, which wasn't entirely true. There had been awkward middle school gym classes and a few fumbling attempts at school dances before I'd learned to avoid them entirely. But something about the way he asked made me want to pretend this was completely new territory for both of us. We started on the periphery of the dance floor, in a space between the actual dancers and the wallflowers, claiming territory that felt simultaneously public and private. Victor's hand settled at my waist with a hesitancy that suggested he was as uncertain about this as I was, and I placed my hand on his shoulder the way I'd seen other people do, hoping muscle memory would compensate for lack of experience. It was awkward at first, the way most genuine moments are. We stepped on each other's feet and laughed about it, made jokes about needing a tutorial from YouTube, found ourselves standing too close and then too far apart as we tried to navigate the appropriate distance for two men dancing together at a high school reunion. But gradually, something shifted. The awkwardness didn't disappear so much as transform into something else, a shared vulnerability that made the clumsiness feel endearing rather than embarrassing. With each song, we grew more comfortable. Victor's hand became steadier at my waist, and I stopped thinking quite so much about where my feet were supposed to go. We talked while we danced, our voices low enough that they felt like secrets even though we weren't saying anything particularly intimate. He told me about the physical therapy practice he'd started, how different it was to help people heal rather than push them to their limits. I found myself describing the strange emptiness of professional success, the way achievement could feel hollow when it wasn't connected to anything deeper. The drinks helped, of course. Each trip to the bar loosened something that had been held tight for too long. Not enough to make us careless, but enough to make honesty feel possible. The reunion provided perfect cover. Everyone was drinking too much and saying things they wouldn't normally say, so our increasingly intimate conversation felt like part of the general atmosphere of nostalgic confession. It was during one of those quiet moments between songs, when we were standing close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, that Victor said something that changed the entire tenor of the evening. He told me he'd been thinking about those years when he'd coached our team, how demanding he'd been, how little patience he'd had for anything less than perfection. He said he'd realized, with the clarity that distance provides, that most of his intensity had been projection. He'd been so afraid of being seen as weak, so terrified of anyone glimpsing the uncertainty beneath his authority, that he'd compensated by becoming harder than necessary, more demanding than the situation required. The admission surprised me with its rawness. This was the man who had seemed unshakable during my adolescence, who had commanded respect through sheer force of will and unwavering standards. Hearing him acknowledge his own fear, his own performance of strength, felt like watching a statue admit it was made of clay after all. I found myself responding with an honesty that matched his. I told him that as a teenager, I'd been terrified of the way his presence affected me, though I'd never been able to articulate what that meant. The way my heart would race when he called my name during practice, the way I'd find excuses to stay after the other players left, hoping for some additional moment of his attention. I told myself it was about basketball, about wanting to be better at the sport, but I'd known even then that there was something else underneath it, something I didn't have words for and wasn't brave enough to examine. Victor listened with the same focused attention he'd brought to our earlier conversations, but now there was something different in his expression, a recognition that went beyond simple understanding. When I finished speaking, he was quiet for a long moment, and I wondered if I'd revealed too much, if I'd crossed some line that would make the rest of the evening impossible. Instead, he stepped closer, closing the small distance between us that we'd been maintaining. His voice, when he finally spoke, was softer than I'd ever heard it. He told me that he'd noticed me too, during those long-ago practices, that there had been something about my intensity, my willingness to push myself past reasonable limits, that had both impressed and worried him. He'd found himself watching for me in ways that felt inappropriate for a coach to watch a student, had caught himself looking forward to our interactions in ways that made him question his own motivations. The ballroom around us seemed to fade as he spoke. The other dancers, the decorations, the noise of conversation and laughter, it all became background to this moment of mutual recognition. We were no longer the coach and student we'd been 18 years ago, no longer bound by the hierarchies and expectations that had kept us at a careful distance. We were just two men in our 30s, finally able to acknowledge something that had been there all along, but had never been safe to name. The boundary between memory and possibility began to blur. The decorated hotel ballroom became a liminal space, suspended between the past we'd lived and the one we might have chosen if we'd been braver, more honest, more willing to risk everything for the chance to be seen as we really were. Standing there in Victor's arms, swaying to music that felt like it was playing just for us, I understood that we were both confronting the ghosts of our youth, not to make peace with them, but to finally, perhaps, set them free. The crowd began to thin as the evening wore on. Couples who'd fulfilled their obligation to nostalgia started making their exits, claiming early mornings and babysitter curfews. The energy in the ballroom shifted from the forced brightness of reunion enthusiasm to something quieter, more intimate. The remaining guests moved with the loose-limbed contentment that comes from good wine and better company, and the conversations grew more honest as the night deepened. Victor and I had claimed a small table near the edge of the dance floor, nursing drinks that had grown warm while we talked. The string lights cast everything in a golden glow that felt forgiving, kind. I found myself studying his face in this softer light, noticing things I'd missed during those intense years when he'd been my coach. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the small scar above his left eyebrow that suggested childhood mischief, the way his entire posture seemed to relax when he forgot to maintain the careful composure that had once been his professional armor. The music had shifted too, becoming background rather than focal point. The DJ seemed to sense the changing mood, trading the aggressive nostalgia of earlier hits for something mellower, more contemplative. It was the kind of music that invited conversation rather than demanding attention, and I was grateful for the cover it provided as our discussion ventured into increasingly personal territory. Victor suggested we step outside for some air, and I followed him through the slowly emptying ballroom toward a side exit that led to the hotel's parking lot. The night was warm but not oppressive, with a slight breeze that felt like relief after hours of recycled air and artificial lighting. The parking lot was nearly deserted, just a few scattered cars belonging to the die-hard reunion attendees who would likely stay until the hotel staff started stacking chairs. The music from inside was muffled but still audible, providing a distant soundtrack to what felt like a completely different world. Out here, away from the decorations and the forced cheer, the artificial nature of the evening became more apparent. But somehow that made the moment between us feel more real, more honest. We were no longer performing for an audience of former classmates. We were just two men standing in a parking lot, surrounded by the quiet honesty that darkness provides. Victor broke the silence first, his voice carrying a weight I hadn't heard before. He told me about watching us as teenagers, how he'd observed our certainty, our belief that we had endless time to become whoever we were meant to be. He said he'd envied that more than he'd ever admitted, even to himself. As our coach, he'd been responsible for channeling our energy, for helping us focus our potential, but he'd never allowed himself to dream the way he'd encouraged us to dream. He'd been so busy being the adult, being the authority figure, that he'd forgotten how to imagine a different future for himself. There was something raw in his confession, something that spoke to the cost of always being the one in charge, the one who had to have answers. I realized I'd never considered what it might have been like for him during those years, surrounded by teenagers who believed anything was possible, while he'd already begun to accept the limitations that age and responsibility impose. I found myself responding with a truth I'd never spoken aloud. I told him I'd never gone to prom because I hadn't known how to show up as myself. The fear had been too overwhelming, the risk too great. I'd spent 4 years in that school learning to hide essential parts of who I was, and prom had represented everything I was most afraid of: being seen, being judged, being found inadequate or wrong or different in ways that mattered. The words came easier than I'd expected, maybe because of the wine, maybe because of the darkness, maybe because Victor's own honesty had created space for mine. I told him that if I had gone, if I'd been brave enough to risk showing up authentically, I thought I would have wanted to go with someone like him. Someone who saw potential in people, who demanded excellence not out of cruelty, but out of belief in what they could become. The air between us shifted. I could feel it, the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. Victor turned toward me more fully, and in the dim light from the parking lot fixtures, his expression carried an intensity that reminded me of those moments during practice when he was about to push us past what we thought we could do. But this was different. This wasn't the coach preparing to demand more from his player. This was a man stepping away from every role and expectation that had defined him, choosing to be seen without the armor of authority or the safety of professional distance. He moved closer, not with the careful restraint that had characterized our dancing, but with the deliberate intention of someone who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. When he kissed me, it was tentative but not uncertain, hesitant but not reluctant. It carried the weight of years of careful distance, of professional boundaries and unspoken recognition, of all the moments when we'd almost acknowledged what was happening between us, but had pulled back at the last second. For me, it was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it confirmed something I'd spent decades trying to understand about myself. Liberating because it finally gave shape to feelings I'd never been able to articulate. The kiss lasted only a moment, but it felt like the culmination of a conversation we'd been having for 18 years without ever speaking the words. When we separated, Victor's eyes held mine with an expression I'd never seen before: vulnerable but not apologetic, uncertain but not regretful. This wasn't the confession of someone who was questioning his judgment. It was the honesty of someone who had finally stopped running from a truth that had been chasing him for longer than he cared to admit. Standing there in the parking lot, with the muffled sounds of our reunion continuing inside and the weight of recognition settling between us, I understood that we had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Whatever happened next, we could no longer pretend that this was just about nostalgia or alcohol or the strange intimacy that reunions sometimes create. This was about something that had been there all along, waiting for us to be brave enough to name it. We stayed outside longer than we probably should have, neither of us ready to return to the ballroom and whatever remained of the reunion. The parking lot felt like neutral territory, a place where we could exist in the aftermath of honesty without having to immediately decide what it meant. Victor leaned against his car, and I found myself standing close enough that our shoulders almost touched, both of us staring out at the empty street beyond the hotel, as if the answers we needed might emerge from the darkness. The kiss had changed something fundamental between us, but it had also raised questions that felt too large to address in a hotel parking lot. What did this mean for two men who lived in the same small town, who would inevitably encounter each other at grocery stores and coffee shops, and the kinds of community events that made anonymity impossible? What did it mean for Victor, who still worked with teenagers in his physical therapy practice, who existed in a professional world where reputation mattered? What did it mean for me, with my carefully ordered life and my equally carefully maintained distance from anything that might require genuine vulnerability? Inside, I could hear the reunion winding down. Music grew softer, conversations became more scattered, and the occasional burst of laughter suggested the kind of deep, slightly drunken camaraderie that comes at the end of a long evening. Soon, people would start collecting coats and saying final goodbyes, would promise to stay in touch with the sincerity of those who know they probably won't, would return to their separate lives with new stories to tell about how everyone looked exactly the same or completely different. Victor broke the silence, his voice carrying a gravity that made me turn toward him fully. He said we couldn't rewrite the past, couldn't go back and give our 17-year-old selves the courage we'd lacked or the wisdom we'd needed. But maybe, he continued, maybe we didn't have to keep living like that past owned us, like those old fears still had the power to dictate our choices. The words hung between us like a challenge and an invitation. I understood that he was talking about more than just this single evening, more than just the recognition that had passed between us. He was talking about the possibility of stepping away from the carefully constructed lives we'd both built, the lives that looked successful from the outside but felt somehow incomplete from within. The choice felt enormous and immediate. We could walk away from this moment, could return to our separate cars and drive to our separate homes, could let this become just another story about the strange intimacy that reunions sometimes create. We could pretend it had been the wine talking, the nostalgia, the artificial romance of string lights and slow music. We could go back to being the coach I'd once known and the student he'd once taught, could maintain the careful distance that had defined our relationship for 18 years. Or we could carry this forward into the harsh light of ordinary days, could risk everything we'd built for the possibility of something more authentic, more true. The thought terrified me in ways I hadn't experienced since adolescence. That same fear of being seen and found wanting, of having my carefully maintained composure crumble under scrutiny. But there was something else beneath the fear, something that felt like hunger after years of careful portion control. The possibility of showing up as myself, without apology or explanation, without the constant effort of maintaining a performance that had become so automatic I'd forgotten it was a choice. The possibility of being with someone who had seen me at my most uncertain, most striving, most desperately hopeful, and who had chosen to be here anyway. Victor seemed to sense my internal struggle. He reached for my hand, not with the passion of our earlier kiss, but with the steady warmth of someone offering an anchor in rough water. His touch was familiar and foreign at once, carrying echoes of encouragement from those long-ago practices, but transformed by the context of this moment, this choice, this crossroads we'd somehow found ourselves navigating. He told me he understood if this felt like too much, too fast, too complicated. He said he'd spent enough years living carefully to know how difficult it could be to choose risk over safety. But he also said, with a quiet intensity that reminded me why I'd once been willing to run suicides until my legs gave out just to earn his approval, that he was tired of living like he was still that scared young man who'd never learned how to be honest about what he wanted. The parking lot around us felt suspended in time, holding space for a decision that would reshape everything that came after. I could feel the pull of old patterns, the familiar comfort of retreat and self-protection. It would be easy to squeeze his hand once, smile with the kind of gentle regret that suggested this had been beautiful but impossible, and walk away with my dignity and my carefully ordered life intact. But I found myself thinking about the man I'd been at 17, standing in his bedroom on prom night, watching his classmates post pictures of a celebration he'd been too afraid to attend. I thought about all the years since then, all the choices I'd made in favor of safety over authenticity, all the relationships I'd let dissolve because they'd required a level of honesty I hadn't been prepared to offer. Standing there with Victor's hand in mine, I realized that some opportunities only come once, and some chances to be brave can't be postponed indefinitely. The night had become our crossroads, and despite every instinct that urged caution, I found myself ready to choose the path that led toward truth, whatever the cost might be. The reunion was ending when we finally returned inside. Tables were being cleared, chairs stacked against walls, and the string lights that had transformed the ballroom into something magical now illuminated the mundane work of cleanup. A few stragglers remained, finishing final conversations and collecting forgotten purses, but the energy of the evening had dissipated into the satisfied exhaustion that follows any successful performance of nostalgia. Victor and I moved through the space like we were seeing it for the first time, though we'd spent hours dancing beneath these same lights. Everything looked different now, smaller, more ordinary, less capable of containing the enormity of what had passed between us. The decorations that had seemed so elaborate earlier in the evening now revealed themselves as what they'd always been: balloons and crepe paper, an earnest attempt to recreate something that existed more powerfully in memory than it ever had in reality. Most of our former classmates had already gone, leaving behind only the evidence of their presence. Empty glasses on tables, programs from the evening scattered across chairs, a few forgotten corsages wilting under the fluorescent lights that had replaced the romantic glow of the string lights. The DJ was packing up his equipment with the efficient movements of someone who'd performed this same ritual countless times, and the hotel staff moved around us with polite discretion, clearly waiting for the last guests to leave so they could finish their work. We should have left then. We should have walked to our separate cars, exchanged phone numbers with the awkward formality of people who weren't quite sure how to categorize what had happened between them, made vague promises about staying in touch that we might or might not have kept. It would have been the reasonable thing to do, the safe thing, the choice that would have preserved the careful boundaries we'd spent decades learning to maintain. Instead, Victor caught my hand as I started to move toward the exit. The ballroom was nearly empty now, just us and the cleanup crew who were too professional to comment on the two men standing together in the middle of a dance floor that was being systematically dismantled around them. He asked if I wanted one last dance, and something in his voice made it clear that this wasn't just a romantic gesture, but a necessary one, a final piece of business that needed to be completed before we could move forward into whatever came next. The DJ had finished packing, but soft music still played from the hotel's sound system, something instrumental and unobtrusive, designed to fill silence rather than command attention. We moved toward each other with none of the hesitation that had characterized our earlier dancing. This time, Victor's hand settled at my waist with certainty, and I placed my hand on his shoulder with the confidence of someone who had finally stopped questioning whether he belonged in this position. The polished floor reflected the few remaining lights, making it seem like we were dancing on the surface of still water. There was no one to watch us now, no audience of former classmates to navigate or impress. Just two men moving slowly across an empty dance floor, finally allowing themselves to exist in a moment they'd both avoided 30 years earlier. The music provided a gentle backdrop, but the real rhythm came from our breathing, from the soft sound of our feet against the floor, from the quiet conversation we carried on while we swayed together. We talked about practical things, phone numbers and coffee dates, the logistics of two people learning to be honest with each other after decades of careful self-protection. But beneath the mundane details was the recognition that we were planning a future that neither of us had quite believed possible an hour earlier. The conversation felt both momentous and ordinary, like planning any relationship except for the weight of years it carried, the sense of finally choosing authenticity over safety. When the song ended, we didn't immediately separate. We stood together in the center of the empty ballroom, surrounded by the debris of an evening that had become something neither of us had anticipated. The hotel staff continued their work around us with professional discretion, and I realized that we were probably the last guests to leave, that we'd lingered past the point of reasonable departure. But I wasn't ready for the evening to end, wasn't ready to return to the careful isolation I'd maintained for so long. Victor seemed to understand this without my having to say it. He suggested we walk out together, and something about the simple offer felt like the most romantic gesture anyone had ever made. The parking lot was nearly deserted now, just our two cars sitting under the security lights like faithful guardians waiting for their owners to return. The night air felt cool and clean after hours in the recycled atmosphere of the ballroom, and I found myself breathing more deeply than I had all evening, as if I were remembering how to fill my lungs properly. We exchanged keys and phone numbers, made plans to meet for coffee the following weekend, spoke with the careful planning of people who understood that what they were beginning required intention and attention. But beneath the practical conversation was something else, a sense of completion, of having finally experienced something that had been waiting for us for 30 years. When Victor drove away, I remained in the parking lot for several minutes, not quite ready to return to my apartment and my carefully ordered life. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the boutonniere I'd bought on impulse that afternoon, a small white rose that I'd never expected to wear. It was slightly crushed from the evening's events, but still recognizable, still carrying the faint scent that would always remind me of this night. The drive home passed in a blur of streetlights and empty roads. Dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the sky, painting everything in soft grays and golds that made the world look newly created. I found myself smiling without conscious decision, an expression that felt unfamiliar but right, like a muscle I'd forgotten how to use. Standing in my apartment as the sun rose fully, I realized that something fundamental had shifted. The carefully maintained order that had once felt like achievement now felt like preparation, not for the life I'd been living, but for the one I was finally ready to begin.